I've lurked on this sub for years, reading other people's messes and thinking, wow, at least I'm not that guy. Turns out I absolutely was. This is one of those stories I always told myself I'd never write because once it's out there, it stops being just mine. But I'm older now, quieter, and the weight of it hasn't really gone away. So here we are. This happened in my early 30s, back when I was convinced I was smarter than most systems and just unlucky enough to deserve a break. I wasn't desperate like can't eat desperate. I had a job, an apartment, a life that looked fine from the outside, but I was drowning in that low grade panic that comes from debt, bad decisions, and the constant feeling that everyone else had gotten a rule book I somehow missed. The crime itself was falsifying an insurance claim. Even typing that out makes my stomach tighten because I remember how casually I framed it. Back then, I didn't call it fraud. I called it leveling the playing field. I paid my premiums, right? Big company, endless money, faceless adjusters. What was one claim going to hurt? That was the story I told myself, over and over, until it felt almost reasonable. What pushed me over the edge wasn't one big disaster, but a stack of small frustrations, a sudden expense, a denied raise, a friend bragging about a payout they got with a shrug and a wink. I remember thinking, if everyone's doing it, then the only sucker is the one who doesn't. That thought should have scared me more than it did. Looking back, this is the part where I wish I'd stopped. This was the last clean moment before plans and lies and that quiet thrill of getting away with something. At the time, though, it felt like the beginning of a solution, not the beginning of a problem that would follow me for years. Before I did anything concrete, there was this weird in-between phase where I just rehearsed the idea in my head. I'd be driving to work or standing in the shower, running through imaginary conversations like it was a movie I was trying to perfect. The insurance company wasn't a company in those fantasies. It was just a voice on the phone, polite and distant, easy to mislead because it wasn't a real person to me yet. I spent a lot of time telling myself I had earned this, years of payments, with nothing to show for it. All those ads promising peace of mind, protection, security. Why was it wrong to finally cash in? I even did this mental math where I compared what I'd paid over the years versus what I might get back, like that somehow turned dishonesty into fairness. I remember Googling things late at night, not even specifics at first, just broad questions, more like reassurance than research. I wasn't looking for how to commit fraud. I was looking for proof that it wasn't a big deal. Forums, comments, throwaway jokes, anything that suggested this was common, survivable, forgettable. Every anecdote where someone said, "Yeah, I did it once. Nothing happened," felt like permission. What's unsettling is how calm I felt. No dramatic music, no moral panic. Just this quiet confidence that I could thread the needle if I stayed reasonable. I promised myself rules. Don't get greedy. Don't lie about everything. Keep it simple. I actually thought having limits made me ethical, like I was drawing a bright line between myself and real criminals. By the end of that week, the decision was already made, even if I hadn't admitted it out loud. I wasn't asking if anymore. I was asking how cleanly. And once your brain switches to that mode, it's amazing how quickly doubt turns into logistics. Once I crossed that invisible line in my head, everything shifted into this unsettling clarity. I started calling it the plan, which made it feel contained, manageable, like a weekend project instead of a felony. I won't get into specifics here, partly because time has blurred the edges and partly because even now I don't like how methodical I was about it. What I will say is that preparation didn't look like mastermind stuff. No cork boards, no dramatic scheming. It was quiet, boring, almost domestic. Double-checking details, making sure my story didn't contradict itself, thinking through what questions might come up and how I'd answer without sounding rehearsed. I remember being weirdly proud of how reasonable everything felt. I also did this thing where I practiced sounding normal. I'd catch myself saying certain phrases out loud, adjusting my tone, trying to strip any hint of nervousness from my voice. It's wild how quickly lying becomes a performance, and how quickly you start critiquing yourself like an actor who wants a better take. There were moments when I hesitated, little flashes of "this is dumb, stop now," but I'd smother them with practicality. I told myself I was just being thorough, just covering my bases. Preparation felt responsible, almost adult. That's the trick. Planning something wrong can feel indistinguishable from planning something right when you ignore the moral part. By the time everything was ready, I felt detached from the risk. The crime had become paperwork and phone calls in my mind, not consequences. I slept better than I should have. That should have been another warning sign. But at the time, I took the calm as proof I was in control. The day I actually did it didn't feel dramatic at all, which somehow made it worse. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was nervous, but because my brain had already decided today's the day. There was this steady hum in my chest, half caffeine, half adrenaline, that made everything feel sharper. I remember sitting there with my phone in my hand longer than I needed to. Not frozen, just savoring the last few seconds where nothing had technically gone wrong yet. Once I made that call, there'd be a timestamp somewhere, a record that said, "William started lying here." That thought flickered through my mind, then vanished as soon as I pressed the button. The person on the other end was exactly as boring and polite as I'd imagined. Calm voice, routine questions, the kind of interaction designed to put you at ease. And it worked. Too well. I slipped into the story like it was muscle memory, hitting the beats I'd rehearsed without sounding like I'd rehearsed them. I even laughed at one point, an instinctive, friendly laugh, and immediately hated myself for how natural it felt. There were small hiccups, questions I hadn't fully anticipated, pauses where I had to slow my breathing and buy myself a second to think, but nothing catastrophic. No alarms, no accusations, just more typing on their end and more nodding on mine, even though they couldn't see me. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt buzzed, like I'd just gotten away with sneaking into somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I stood up from the chair and paced my apartment, replaying everything I'd said, looking for cracks. But all I could think was, that's it? That was easy. That realization scared me more than any threat ever could have because it made the whole thing feel repeatable. After the call, there was nothing to do, and that turned out to be the hardest part. I'd expected some immediate feedback, an email, a follow-up, anything to confirm the world had registered what I'd just done. Instead, there was silence. Days of it. Just me and my thoughts, which were suddenly a lot louder than before. At first I rode the high. I checked my bank account more than I cared to admit, even though I knew nothing would show up that fast. I caught myself daydreaming about what I'd use the money for, framing it as fixing things instead of what it really was, rewarding myself for lying convincingly. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, half hoping and half dreading. It was them. Then the paranoia crept in. I started rereading emails like they were coded messages. A completely unrelated call from an unknown number sent me spiraling for a solid 10 minutes. I replayed the conversation in my head again and again, zooming in on every pause, every word I might have over-explained. I became convinced I'd said one thing slightly wrong, just enough to raise a flag. What messed with me the most was how normal everything else felt. I still went to work, still joked with coworkers, still bought groceries and complained about traffic. Meanwhile, there was this secret sitting in my chest, warm and volatile, like a battery that hadn't exploded yet. Made every normal interaction feel faintly dishonest, like I was wearing a disguise, only I could see. At night, the guilt showed up uninvited. Not dramatic guilt, no sobbing or moral epiphanies, just this low, persistent unease. I'd think about the person on the phone, how they'd been polite, how they'd trusted what I said because it was literally their job to. I told myself they were just doing paperwork. Still, the thought stuck. By the end of that waiting period, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't scared of being caught as much as I was scared of how quickly this had become part of my routine, and that scared me in a way money never could. The silence finally broke with an email that looked harmless enough. Standard formatting, neutral language, nothing accusatory. But my stomach dropped anyway. I must have read it 5 times before it fully sank in. They needed clarification, not proof, not an investigation. Just a couple of follow-up questions to complete the file. On the surface, it was reasonable. That's what made it terrifying. I spent an entire evening drafting and redrafting my response. Every sentence felt like it could tip the balance between routine and suspicious. I deleted perfectly fine explanations because they sounded too defensive. Then I worried the shorter version sounded evasive. It was like trying to walk a tightrope while pretending you weren't on one. What really got under my skin was how polite they were, thanking me for my patience, apologizing for the inconvenience. That tone did something to me. It reframed the whole thing. I wasn't outsmarting a machine anymore. I was corresponding with someone who had taken time to read my words and ask for more. I felt like a jerk, and not in a dramatic, movie villain way. Just in that small, everyday way that's harder to shake. I sent the response eventually, hands slightly shaky, heart thudding harder than it had during the original call. The moment it was gone, I wanted it back. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a single act. It was a chain. Every answer required another answer. Every lie demanded maintenance. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining my file landing on the wrong desk, someone frowning at it just a little longer than necessary. I tried to remind myself that this was still under control, still within reason. But for the first time since I started, I felt the faint but unmistakable sense that I was reacting now, not leading. And once you realize you're reacting, you also realize you're no longer in charge. After that email, the lie stopped being an event and became an environment. It was everywhere. I'd be mid-conversation at work and suddenly wonder if my face looked guilty for no reason. I'd laugh at a joke and immediately think, should I be this relaxed? It's exhausting, policing your own normalcy. What surprised me most was how much mental space it took up. Not just fear, logistics. Remembering what I'd already said, making sure I didn't casually contradict myself if the topic drifted anywhere near insurance, money, or bad luck. I started avoiding certain conversations altogether, not because anyone suspected anything, but because I couldn't trust myself to stay consistent. Friends noticed I was distracted. One of them asked if I was okay, and I almost laughed at how loaded that question felt. I gave some vague answer about stress and work, which was technically true. The stress just had a very specific, very illegal source. That was the first time I felt the lie spilling outward, touching parts of my life it had nothing to do with. There were moments when I considered backing out, calling them, confessing, saying I'd made a mistake. But even that felt like a decision with consequences I couldn't predict. I told myself it was too late to make it clean, which is a convenient thing to believe when you don't want to face the mess you've made. Oddly enough, there were flashes of pride mixed in with the anxiety. I hated that part, the part of me that thought, you're holding it together. That voice scared me more than the fear did, because it sounded comfortable, adaptable, like it could get used to this. By the time another update came through, another neutral message, another step forward, I realized something had shifted permanently. Even if I walked away unscathed, I wouldn't be the same guy who'd made that first call. I'd already learned how easy it was to split myself in two, the version everyone saw, and the one quietly keeping score in his head. The confirmation came on a random weekday morning. No fanfare, no dramatic wording, just a notification that the claim had been approved and funds were on the way. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, waiting for the punchline, like maybe it was a test or a typo, but it wasn't. It was real. When the money actually hit my account, my first reaction wasn't joy. It was this sharp, electric jolt of, oh no. Numbers don't lie, even when you do. Seeing it there made everything irreversible in a way conversations and emails hadn't. This wasn't a story anymore, it was a transaction. I tried to keep my behavior normal. I told myself I wouldn't splurge, wouldn't do anything that screamed sudden cash. That lasted about a week. Not because I went wild, but because even small purchases felt loaded. Every swipe of my card came with a whisper in my head. This is what you bought with it. Groceries, gas, a replacement for something that had been broken for months. Ordinary things now faintly tainted. There was a moment, standing in line somewhere mundane, when I felt this weird mix of triumph and shame crash into each other. I'd won by my old logic. The system hadn't stopped me. No alarms, no consequences. And yet, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd crossed into a version of myself I didn't recognize, one who could rationalize almost anything if the outcome was convenient enough. I told myself this was the end of it. Claim done, story complete. I just needed to move on and let the anxiety fade. But the truth is, once the money became real, so did the risk. And for the first time, I started to wonder if getting away with it might actually be the worst possible outcome. After the money settled into my account, I became hyper-aware of every interruption. Doorbells on TV made my pulse spike. A car idling outside too long felt intentional. I knew, logically, that investigations don't work like my imagination portrayed them. But logic doesn't stand a chance against guilt once it gets comfortable. What really messed with me was how nothing happened. No follow-up emails, no surprise calls. Just the quiet continuation of life. That absence became its own kind of threat. I kept thinking, like, they're just building a case, because that felt more believable than the idea that I'd slipped through. I rehearsed explanations I was never asked to give. If someone questioned me, I'd say it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error. I'd play dumb, polite, cooperative. I hated myself for how ready I was. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing you can justify almost anything if it means self-preservation. At the same time, the fear started to dull. Not disappear, just smooth around the edges. Days passed, then weeks. The imagined knock never came, and in that space, another dangerous thought crept in. Maybe this really is over. That's when I understood how people escalate. Not because they're reckless, but because the silence feels like approval. And once fear fades, what's left is habit. As the weeks turned into months, my internal monologue shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it stopped being the dominant voice. In its place came explanations, polished, persuasive, and deeply self-serving. I told myself the claim had been reviewed, approved, closed. That meant something, right? Systems don't just hand out money without checks. If there'd been a problem, it would have surfaced by now. I caught myself reframing the whole thing when I thought about it. Not I lied, but I interpreted things generously. Not fraud, but gray area. Language matters more than we like to admit. Change the words, and suddenly the weight shifts just enough to breathe under it. There were moments I almost believed my own edits. I'd think back to the stress I was under at the time and feel a flash of sympathy for past me, like he'd been cornered into doing something slightly questionable but understandable. That perspective was comforting and dangerous. It made the story smoother, easier to carry around without flinching. But every now and then, usually late at night, the original version would break through, the unedited one, the one where I remembered how deliberate I'd been, how carefully I'd avoided saying certain things, how I'd felt that buzz of getting away with it. Those moments snapped me back to reality, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering which version of myself was the real one. I didn't talk about it with anyone, not even in vague terms. Keeping it secret felt like part of the sentence, something I'd earned along with the money. And the longer I kept it, the more it felt welded to me, less like something I'd done, more like something I was. The thing that finally rattled me again wasn't an investigator or a letter with an official seal. It was a casual conversation, a coworker complaining about an insurance issue, rolling their eyes, saying how claims get flagged all the time and how one tiny inconsistency can drag things out for months. They weren't talking to me, not really, but it felt like the air got sucked out of the room anyway. I went cold, heart pounding, face hot, brain sprinting ahead to worst case scenarios. Flagged. Inconsistency. I nodded along like a normal human while internally dismantling my own story, checking it for cracks I might have missed. For the rest of the day, I was useless. Every notification felt heavier. Every email preview looked vaguely threatening. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. But that was the point. It showed me how little control I actually had. One offhand comment, one reminder of how fragile my success was, and I was right back in that anxious spiral. The lie wasn't asleep. It was just waiting. That night, I realized I'd built my peace on silence. As long as nobody asked questions, I could pretend the chapter was closed, but the moment the topic surfaced, anywhere, in any form, I was exposed all over again. I started to understand that even if the outside world had moved on, my nervous system hadn't gotten the memo. It dawned on me then that I wasn't really afraid of being caught anymore. I was afraid of never being fully relaxed again, afraid that I'd permanently traded a sense of ease for a one-time payout, and that felt like a worse bargain than I'd ever admit out loud. At some point, I made a conscious effort to stop thinking about it. Not in a healthy, processed way, more like shoving everything into a mental box and taping it shut. I told myself I'd paid the price in stress already, that continuing to dwell on it was pointless. What was done was done. No one was knocking. Life was moving on. So should I changed a few habits. Almost superstitiously. I stopped checking my account so often. I avoided news stories about fraud or insurance entirely, like they might somehow recognize me through the screen. When the topic came up socially, I'd excuse myself or go quiet, pretending to scroll my phone. It worked, superficially. Days would pass without the knot in my chest tightening, but suppression has a leak. It always does. Every now and then, something small would punch a hole in that box, a form to fill out, a policy renewal notice, even just seeing the company's logo somewhere random. The memory would rush back, vivid and unwelcome, and I'd feel that old mix of embarrassment and defensiveness flare up. I wasn't panicking anymore, but I also wasn't free. What bothered me most was how much energy it took to not think about it. That's when I realized this wasn't just about fear of consequences, it was about identity. I liked thinking of myself as a decent person who made a bad call under pressure, but this thing didn't stay neatly in the past. It followed me, quietly challenging that self-image whenever I let my guard down. Burying it kept me functional. It didn't make me whole. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that unless I faced it honestly, even just with myself, it would always have a way of resurfacing when I least expected it. The reckoning didn't come from outside. It came in quieter moments, usually when nothing else was demanding my attention. I'd catch my reflection in a dark window or hear my own voice telling some harmless story, and there it was, that split-second hesitation where I wondered if I believed myself as much as I sounded like I did. I realized I'd started auditing my own honesty, not just about the crime, but about everything. Little white lies felt louder. Exaggerations stuck in my throat. It was like my internal barometer had been recalibrated, and now I couldn't ignore when I crossed even minor lines. Ironically, the big lie had made me hypersensitive to the small ones. There was no one else in the room judging me. No authority. No victim confronting me. Just me, asking a question I couldn't dodge anymore. If I'm capable of that, what else am I capable of? That thought haunted me more than any legal consequence ever could. I didn't suddenly become a saint. I didn't donate the money or confess to anyone. But I did start to notice how much effort I put into maintaining the version of myself I wanted to be seen as, reliable, fair, decent, and how fragile that image felt once I knew, for a fact, that I could violate it and still function. That's the thing nobody tells you. Getting away with it doesn't erase the act, it just transfers the burden inward. You become the witness, the record, the judge you can't escape. By the time a full year had passed, it was clear I wasn't going to be caught. No letters, no audits, no retroactive consequences swooping in to restore some cosmic balance. On paper, I'd won, and that realization landed with a dull thud instead of relief. The cost showed up in subtler ways. I hesitated more before making decisions, like I no longer trusted my instincts. I second-guessed my own motives. Do I want this because it's right or because it benefits me? That question used to be abstract. Now it was personal. Sticky. Hard to shake. I noticed a small but permanent erosion of confidence. Not the loud kind, more like a hairline crack. I'd achieved something through deception, and part of my brain filed that away as evidence that outcomes didn't necessarily correlate with effort or integrity. That's a corrosive lesson. It makes genuine wins feel slightly counterfeit, like you're waiting for someone to point out the trick. There was also this quiet loneliness to it. I couldn't share the story, not really. Not without consequences I wasn't ready to face. So, it stayed locked inside, shaping my reactions without ever being acknowledged. When people talked about honesty or fairness, I'd nod along, feeling like I was speaking a second language I used to be fluent in. I didn't spiral. I didn't self-destruct. Life went on, but I carried this awareness that I'd crossed a line and survived, and that survival had changed the math of who I thought I was. That's the part nobody warns you about. Sometimes the punishment isn't losing what you took. It's losing the uncomplicated version of yourself you had before you took it. I'm writing this now because enough time has passed that the story feels complete. Not resolved, just finished. I didn't get caught. I didn't confess. The world didn't balance the scales for me. And if you're reading this hoping for a dramatic twist at the end, that's kind of the point. There isn't one. What I learned is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Cheating the system doesn't feel like rebellion when you're done. It feels small, quiet, like you traded something solid for something flimsy and then had to pretend it was worth it. The money solved a short-term problem and introduced a long-term one I didn't know how to name at first: distrust of myself. If you're standing where I stood, stressed, justified, convinced you're the exception, I won't preach. I know how airtight those arguments feel when they're echoing in your own head. Just know this: the system isn't the only thing keeping score. You are. And you don't get to close the case the way an insurance company does. My advice: if you're looking for relief, this isn't it. If you're looking for a shortcut, understand that shortcuts don't just skip steps, they skip parts of you. And even if nothing bad ever happens on paper, something shifts inside that's hard to undo. I live a normal life now. I laugh, I work, I sleep fine most nights. But every so often I remember how easy it was to become someone I swore I wasn't. That memory keeps me honest in a way rules never did. If nothing else, let my story be a warning. Getting away with it is not the same thing as being free.